So as we look at this second party system then, coming out of the 1828 election, you do have a second party system made up of Democrats, the party of Jackson, and National Republicans, or Whigs. They chose the name Whigs to sort of suggest their relationship to the old parliamentary loyal opposition in England, or even revolutionary radicals. And for the Democrats, for their part, in a general way, not just Jackson himself, but the Democratic Party, or the Democrats who were voting for him, who were these common men? Well, in the most general sense, these Democrats, their characteristics would have been, they would have been in favor of a limited government, they would have been in favor of free trade and local rule, and they definitely wanted economic opportunity, but for white males. It's sort of a very limited thing in terms of the equality. They didn't like monopolies, didn't like the national bank, saw it as a tool of the wealthy, and they didn't like high tariffs or high land prices for the most part. The core of Jackson's voter support in this way, we'll get into, is going to largely be Southerners, Westerners, frontiersmen, and urban workers and laborers. As for the Whigs are going to favor Clay's American system. Clay's idea that we'd seen in our earlier chapters a few reviews ago about a high protective tariff, government being actively involved, the positive liberal state. Government should be actively involved in managing the economy, helping to protect and grow American jobs and industries, because that's going to make the nation strong. They would have favored internal improvements. They would have opposed, to a certain degree, immigration, because they would have seen it as leading to some vice, some immorality, and also the competing Irish religions, Catholicism being the Irish Catholic religion during this time. Mostly New Englanders, the old Federalist class in many ways. Mid-Atlantic states, New Englanders, upper middle Westerners, Protestant, older class stock Americans. Those were the National Whigs or the National Republicans, or the Whigs. So Jackson sweeps into the presidency with an agenda. First of all, he doesn't like Henry Clay. He sees Clay as being the guy behind the corrupt bargain who'd swindled him out of the White House in 1824. Clay is Speaker of the House, and he's against the bank. Jackson felt the bank was a corrupt tool of the rich, and as a champion of the common man, he said the bank was this tool through which the rich could manipulate the economy, maybe even manipulate government. And so Jackson felt the bank was something that had to be destroyed. Prior to the bank, though, we'll have time for that battle in just a second. The first key crisis that comes up for Jackson actually involves the tariff. In 1828, a tariff was placed, a tax on imported goods, is placed into law by northern states championing some of these Clay-type American system ideas. Remember why a tax protects home industries. A tax on foreign goods means that competing goods from overseas now cost more for that same product, so it steers consumers to want to buy the American product instead. That's great if you're exporting the products, not so great if you're importing them. And so this sort of gets into some of the crises and issues that Jackson was going to have to deal with. If you look up at our map here for a second, remember we had seen all the industrial development and production taking place in the Northeast in our previous lessons. They're producing things. They want their industries protected so they can continue to produce those things and develop those industries. The southern states, as we'd seen from our previous lessons, had a one-crop production system. They were largely a plantation-based commercial agricultural society. So they import their raw cotton out and they export in everything else that they need. Guns, tools, plows, knives, furniture, clothing, everything they needed was exported in. So a tax on imported goods actually makes these Southerners pay more for those goods than they otherwise would. This is what really drives the South up in arms about a tariff. And they nicknamed the tariff of 1828 the tariff of abominations, like an abominable snowman. The word abominable means horrible. So they saw this as being a horrible, horrible, awful tariff. And so as such, Southern states, led by South Carolina, in particular, home of John C. Calhoun, who's Andrew Jackson's vice president at this point in time. He used to be a war hawk, used to be a nationalist advocating for war in 1812 to expand the federal power, expand the nation, expand their territory against British encroachment. South Carolina finds themselves in a position of saying, we think this tariff is so awful that we're not going to pay it. And they're going to essentially threaten something we'd seen earlier, an AP history word, nullification. They're going to threaten to nullify or reject this tariff, to say that they do not have to follow federal law and pay these tax levies. Well, Andrew Jackson was and was not many things, but as a unionist, as a nationalist, Jackson felt that this was absolutely unacceptable, that states could not pick and choose the laws that they sought to follow. To do so, And to say you're going to back that up, he said, would essentially render the federal union meaningless. And if South Carolina threatens to nullify and resist federal attempts to collect this tariff, Jackson famously said, disunion by armed force is treason. And he comes out strongly against this, and strongly against his own vice president, John Calhoun. Calhoun, for his part, writes what becomes the doctrine or Bible for this sort of thinking, the South Carolina Exposition and Protest, which is a document that essentially lays out that if a state feels that a federal law is wrong, that a federal law is unjust or uncomfortable, they can render that law null and void and not have to follow it. By doing so, Jackson begins his break, in many ways, with Calhoun, because Calhoun finds his position untenable. If he's going to stay on in political power in South Carolina, he can't really remain a devout nationalist, unionist anymore. He has to start reflecting and representing the interests of that southern region. Ultimately, Calhoun resigns the presidency, as you recall, goes back to South Carolina, becomes a senator from the state, and spends the next 20, 30 years of his life as an active defender and champion of the regional interests of the South. So he becomes an ardent sectionalist as opposed to beginning his life as a nationalist. The Webster-Hayne debate, in many ways, is about these issues. It was a debate that was about whether or not you could, states' rights versus federalism, could you really nullify or separate from the Union? Now, while this is going on, Webster argues vehemently you can't, that this cannot be done in this debate. It's a 3-day debate. It's a famous one that you've read about in your own history texts already. Jackson argues that not only can this not be done, but through his sympathizers in Congress, he gets a Force Act passed, which would empower the president to be able to use the Army to enforce the tariff in South Carolina. Jackson threatens to march on South Carolina and says John Calhoun will be the first man hung. Now, while he's doing this, though, Jackson is really behind the scenes, behind his bluster, actively negotiating for a peaceful compromise, a far better solution to this. And what Jackson does is, with Henry Clay hammers out a compromise tariff of 1833, which solves the problem. Keeps the tariff at a certain rate, but then lowers it over time back to pre-1828 levels. Now, this is good news for the Union. But like we saw with the Hartford Convention and earlier units, like we saw with the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, which were against the Alien Sedition Acts, this is all tying history together, linkage stuff that's really important for the exam. We don't actually solve the problem. We don't confront the issue of, does a state have the right to ignore federal law? Instead, we get to that point, but then both sides kind of back away and we solve the issue by compromise and sweep the actual political question of nullification under the rug. We kick it down the road. So we solve the problem by compromise, but we never definitively answer the question of whether or not a state is empowered to do this. We don't force the issue. And so the tariff question is an example of this lingering, bubbling kind of thing that is out there that hasn't quite been resolved. And it's not the last time we're going to see an issue of states' rights versus federal authority. On to the bank, which we hinted at just a little bit earlier. Jackson is going to view it as his life's work in many ways to destroy the bank. He did see this bank as a moneyed tool to propertied classes, and he saw it as limiting democracy in America instead of expanding it. Clay and the National Republicans could not disagree more. Clay and the National Republicans saw the bank as a vital, almost Hamiltonian kind of tool, doing those Hamiltonian kinds of ends, strengthening the economy, providing a clearinghouse for financial and commercial activity within the United States, etc. And so they sought to, under the President Nicholas Biddle, keep the bank and showed the bank was very important. Clay and Biddle decided to bring the bank up for its recharter 2 years early in 1832, hoping to force Jackson into doing it, otherwise it'll look bad in an election year. Jackson famously vetoes the bank charter, says, "I will not sign this," and makes the bank issue the key issue of the 1832 election. A vote for Clay, who's running against him in 1832, is a vote to keep the bank. A vote for Jackson's a vote to kill it. Well, Jackson, through his political, his language of the common man and the political machine of the Democratic Party, built in many ways by him and Martin Van Buren, is able to win a substantial victory, which he interprets correctly, for the most part, as a mandate from the people to take the bank apart. So Jackson begins taking the bank apart. His veto stands, but he doesn't even do that. He begins withdrawing federal funds early from the bank and depositing them at random state banks across the United States. These were the so-called pet banks. Now, doing so all of a sudden provides a windfall. It provides all these states with extra funding in their banks, or not states, it provides all these state banks with extra funding in their vaults they did not anticipate. Now, money in the vault does these banks no good. The idea is to get the money out there to make more money in the form of loans, so they can get interest back, etc. This leads to over-speculation. It leads to banks making reckless financial decisions with this money, using it to loan out and overheating the economy in some ways. Jackson saw this and actually tried to slow it down by issuing a piece of legislation called the Specie Circular, which required all federal land payments to be made in gold, hoping to slow down the explosion in paper money and banknotes as being put out. It ultimately fails and is going to lead to an economic panic or crash. The last one we'd seen in 1819, this will be the Panic of 1837. Jackson will be out of office by this point in time, and his successor, Martin Van Buren, his hand-picked successor, will be saddled with the wreckage, the economic wreckage of it. But we'll talk about that in a moment or two.